Week 8 of the fantasy football season. He has wide receiver start sits every matchup this week. First game, Thursday night, Minnesota Vikings at the Los Angeles Rams. Justin Jefferson, obviously a start each and every week. One of the best wide receivers once again in fantasy football, and a good matchup at this Ram team. Jordan Addison is sit. The last couple of weeks we haven't seen much out of Jordan Addison after that 2-touchdown performance many weeks ago at the Green Bay Packers. And pretty much this offense is about running the football with Aaron Jones and Justin Jefferson. So with every team on the slate this week, Jordan Addison an easy sit. Now to the Rams, Cooper Kupp has started. Looks like he's returning to the lineup. A snap count is Cooper Kupp. He's still a great wide receiver. And even if he plays, let's say, 75% of the snaps, he's still going to be productive. I know it's a tougher matchup versus one of the better defenses in the league, but we just saw Amon-Ra St. Brown go out there and dominate this defense. And I think Cooper Kupp is a good option this week. Tutu Demarcus Robinson. This hits for me in this game. It's not enough going over the last few weeks where they had expanded roles, both these wide receivers, to be consistent options week in and week out. So now with Cooper Kupp back, even if it's not 100%, their value definitely takes a hit. Green Bay Packers at the Jacksonville Jaguars. Jaden Reed, he's a start. One of the best yard after catch wide receivers in all pro football. Him and Jordan Love have a great rapport. And once again, in a great matchup with the Jaguars, he's a start. Dotavian Wicks, he's a flex option. Wicks, the last couple weeks, he's found the end zone, and he's been the number 2 option in this offense. But it seems like every other week it's someone else for this Green Bay Packer team. Besides Jaden Reed, one week it's Dobbs behind Reed, then Christian Watson, then Wicks. But in my opinion, I think Wicks is the second best wide receiver in this receiving room. And this week, he's a flex option for me. Romeo Dobbs, Christian Watson a sit. Last week, we didn't see much from Christian Watson. He didn't do anything. And he's just a total boom or bust type of player at this point at the wide receiver position. So with the boom or bust ability, with Jordan Love spreading the football out to all these wide receivers, he's a sit. Romeo Dobbs, same thing. He'll have one good game, 2 bad games type of flow for Romeo Dobbs, and he's just tough to trust with every team playing. Brian Thomas, he's a start each and every week, and pretty much the only wide receiver I have confidence in weekly for this Jacksonville Jaguar team. So even in the tough matchup, Thomas is a start. Last week, a nice ball game once again for him. Christian Kirk, Gabe Davis, both sits. They've been inconsistent all season long. And even with Gabe Davis, he really hasn't been a fantasy option for a couple seasons now, where he'll have one big pop games and then his numbers will disappear. Weeks on end, Arizona Cardinals at the Miami Dolphins. Marvin Harrison's a start. I know the numbers haven't been great at all, and him and Kyler Murray just aren't hitting on plays at all for this Arizona Cardinal team. So he's a great talent, but obviously where he went second, third round range in most fantasy drafts, he's been a bust, no doubt about it. Wilson is just not consistent week in and week out production for Michael Wilson. Last week, he didn't do much at all, 2.5 fantasy points in PPR leagues, and even in a decent matchup at the Dolphins, he's a sit. Tyreek Hill, he's a starter. Looks like Tua possibly could return in this ball game for the Miami Dolphins. And we know when Tua and Tyreek Hill are on the same page, this offense takes off and the fantasy numbers take off. So he's a must start. If Tua's back, Jalen Waddle a flex option. Obviously, he's taken a huge hit, his fantasy numbers over the last 5-6 weeks since Tua's been out of the lineup. He's been unplayable, is Jalen Waddle. But even if Tua, let's say 70-80%, Jalen Waddle, he's still going to go out there, I believe, be a decent flex option. New York Jets at the New England Patriots. Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson, both starts for me. I know Garrett Wilson had trouble with some passes in last week's ball game, but this offense, I think they could go out there. And this New England defense, they just got torched by Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguar offense. So Adams and Wilson, 2 good receivers, no doubt about it, on this Jet offense. Even Adams last week in his debut, 9 targets. So the ESP was there with Aaron Rodgers. I know he missed him on a couple throws, but this week in a great matchup, both starts. Alan Lazard, just the volume isn't going to be there as much. Even in a good matchup, I can't trust Lazard this week with every team playing. He's a sit. And now to the Patriots, inconsistencies all season long. Pretty much Hunter Henry and Stevenson, the only 2 viable options on this offense for fantasy football. So Jalen Polk, he went out there last week and thinks he has the best hands in the league. He dropped a couple balls. He hasn't done anything all season long. And Demario Douglas, he's had a couple pop games here and there, but he's not really a fantasy option in a tough matchup as well. Baltimore Ravens at the Cleveland Browns. Zay Flowers, he's a start each and every week. I know last week he didn't do anything in that ball game, but it was one of those weeks where Lamar, he spread the football out, 5 touchdowns. Andrews found the end zone twice, and Derrick Henry once again had the monster game, going over 160 yards on the ground and having a 13-yard touchdown in that ball game. So Zay Flowers, I think he bounces back. Division matchup, but they're going to need him in this one. Rashad Bateman, the last 4 weeks, he's definitely stepped up, and he's getting double-digit fantasy points weekly. So last week, a nice 49-yard touchdown for Rashad Bateman, and he had 23 fantasy points in PPR league. So he's been a nice deep ball threat, nice guy down the seam for Lamar in this offense. And Bateman, he's always had potential, just injuries have held him back. But this season, he's looked good. So this week, I think he's a decent flex option. Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore all sits for me. This offense, we just don't know if it's going to be Thompson Robinson or Jameis Winston for this Cleveland Brown team. But I know Cedric Tillman, he came off a monster game, 8 catches, 81 yards, and a 2-point conversion. So definitely someone to be owned in 12, 14-team leagues. But still, in this ball game, he's a sit for me. And if he goes out there once again, has a good game, he will be a start, possibly down the line. And Jerry Jeudy, pretty much haven't seen much from him this season. He's a sit. And Elijah Moore, he's been that 4th receiver for the most part this season. The sit as well. Philadelphia Eagles at the Bengals. Some of the top 2 wide receiving cores in all the league. A.J. Brown a start each and every week. 2 games in a row back. He's found the end zone and gone over 80 yards in those games for the Eagles. So he's a start. Devonta Smith, I know last week it was a down game. He didn't do anything, 0.80 fantasy points in PPR leagues, but I think he bounces back. And this is going to be a ball game where I think Philadelphia is going to have to throw the football more. I know it was the Saquon Barkley revenge ball game last week at the Giants where he went for over 175 yards and a touchdown on the ground. But I think Smith gets back into the offense, has a good game. Jamar Chase, T. Higgins locked in weekly as starters. Chase and Higgins both found the end zone last week in the victory at the Cleveland Browns. And this week in a potential shootout versus the Eagles, I like them. Indianapolis Colts at the Texans. Another division matchup. Michael Pittman, Josh Downs, Alec Pierce all sits. Anthony Richardson, he's just a quarterback that's not spreading the football out. He's not getting it to his playmakers, and they're not really putting up numbers. And with a full slate, and this team liking to run the football more with Anthony Richardson under center, unlike Joe Flacco, where he's a gunslinger, and these receivers put up numbers, they will sit. Stephon Diggs is start. I know last week this offense totally did nothing at all in the passing game, where C.J. Stroud only had 88 pass yards, but I think Diggs bounces back in this ball game. He's still the number 1 now with Nico Collins out at least a few more weeks with the hamstring injury. So Diggs, he's a start. Tank Dell, flex option. Last week he had the goose egg. I know he got targeted a few times in the end zone, but that Green Bay defense was suffocating, and they couldn't move the football in the passing game. But Joe Mixon bailed them out and got them the victory. So this week in a matchup, Houston back home after the last 2 games on the road. And I don't think this Colt defense is all that good. I think Tank Dell is still a flex option. Tennessee Titans at the Lions. DeAndre Hopkins, Calvin Ridley's a sit for me. I know Ridley last week got a little bit better. And we also know DeAndre Hopkins is banged up. But this offense, if it's Will Levis, Mason Rudolph, whoever is at quarterback, production really hasn't been there at all this season besides Tony Pollard out of the backfield. So easy sits with a full slate of games. Lions, Amon-Ra St. Brown, he was a top 5-6 pick overall going into fantasy drafts. He's lived up to the bill once again this season. And now with Jameson Williams suspended 2 games, I think a little more targets will be spread out in this offense. But obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown getting some of them. So this week he's locked in, even in a tougher matchup with Snead most likely on him. He's a start. Tim Patrick now, I'm assuming, is going to step in as number 2 wide receiver. And he's looked good at times, this Tim Patrick, in the slot and playing that number 3 wide receiver role for this Lion team. But we have to see more out of him. And it is only 2 games that Williams is out. So Patrick is sit. Atlanta Falcons at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Drake London, the last 3 weeks he's been locked in. Him and Kirk Cousins have a good rapport. He's a must start. In the last matchup versus these 2 teams, we saw him go out there for over 150 yards and find the end zone. So London, an easy start. Darnell Mooney a few weeks ago, he went for 9 for 105 and 2 touchdowns versus Tampa Bay Buck team. So he's a flex option for me. Last couple of weeks, the numbers are dropped off here for Darnell Mooney. And this week, every team playing, it's going to be tough to rank him. Nothing more than a flex option. Now to this Tampa Bay Bucks, Chris Godwin, devastating dislocated ankle at the end of the ball game with under a minute left, down 10. I don't know why he was in the ball game. It just didn't make sense. And Chris Godwin, he's going to be out for the season. in a contract season. And Mike Evans, we saw him that ball game in the second quarter as well with the hamstring in the back of the end zone. And Baker Mayfield, he was very concerned. So I believe Mike Evans, he's going to be out for this week's game. And like I said already, we know Chris Godwin's out for the season, the way that ankle turned and it dislocated. So now Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard, next two guys up in the receiving room. And Jalen McMillan, obviously they had high hopes for him coming into the season as a rookie. And now he's going to be operating as that number 1 or 2 wide receiver. But like I said, I have to see it out of these plays before I put him in the starting lineup. But definitely 12-team leagues or deeper, both Jalen McMillan and Sterling Shepard's heads New Orleans Saints. At the Chargers, not much going on in the receiving game for these two teams this season. Chris Olave still in concussion protocol. If he does return, he's going to be a start for me. We know Olave's a good wide receiver. Now Rashid out for the season with the knee injury. More targets will go Olave's way. Bub means Cedric Wilson, with every team playing this week, these players aren't starts. I know the last couple weeks they've showed some flashes and put up numbers, but in a tougher matchup versus a good defense, there sit Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, Joshua Palmer, all sits for me. Ladd McConkey, he didn't show up at all last week in a plus matchup at the Cardinals, and that was also with Quentin Johnston out of the lineup, so he's a sit. I know Herbert went over 300 yards, but he didn't find the end zone in that game as well, so it was the Will This Week ball game last week for this Charger team, but this offense is inconsistent in the passing game. And all these wide receivers really haven't done much. I know Palmer had one of his best games of the season, but still, I wouldn't count on him. Buffalo Bills at the Seahawks, Amari Cooper. First game as a Bill success, found the end zone in last week's ball game. And this week, he's a start. We know the secondary of the Seahawks hasn't been good, even though on paper it's a great unit, but it hasn't translated to the field. And as Cooper picks up the playbook even more, he's a start for me. Khalil Shakir, Keon Coleman, flex options. With a full game of slates, it's tough to see these guys pretty much even in the top 45 of the rankings this week. But Shakir bounced back last week, 13.5 fantasy points. And Keon Coleman finally had the breakout game, 4 for 125 on 7 targets. And now with Amari Cooper becoming the number 1 wide receiver, Shakir and Keon Coleman, they go back into roles where they're going to fit in well as number 2 and 3 wide receivers, where obviously they don't have a top corner on them and they could beat that single coverage. So this week I like them as flex options. DK Metcalf, we saw him leave that ball game last week, but it doesn't look too serious in my opinion. But we'll see as the week goes on and the reports. But DK Metcalf, he's been a monster for the most part this season. I know I had a couple hiccups versus San Francisco and the New York Giants in weeks 5 and week 6, but now he's back. He's Metcalf, and he had the big ball game season start. Jackson Smith-Njigba, he's a boom or bust wide receiver this season. One big game, one bad game pattern it's been for him. And this week, not the greatest of matchups, where this Bill team's definitely getting it going and playing better the last few weeks. And Tyler Lockett, he's a flex option for me as well. He's been solid over the last few weeks. We know he's a third down go-to guy and still one of the best route runners, even though I thought he's lost a step. Obviously, he's Tyler Lockett, but still someone who's a flex. Chicago Bears at the Commanders. DJ Moore, he's a start for the Chicago Bear team. Coming off the bye week, still working on rapport and trying to get things down to where it was last season with Fields, with Caleb Williams. But DJ Moore, he's a great talent, and this week I would start him in this matchup. Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, both sits. I know Allen in that game versus the Jaguars in week 6 went out there, 5 catches, 41 yards, 2 touchdowns. But we have to see more out of Keenan Allen, and I just believe he's going to have a lingering injury all season long with that hamstring and knee area. So he's a sit. Rome Odunze, besides one pop game in week 3, over 100 yards versus the Colts. We haven't seen much from him. He's a sit. Now to the Commanders, I've said this every week, there's pretty much no fantasy options in the receiving game. Besides Terry McLaurin, Jaden Daniels will be back. Now obviously he was a big lead for this Commander team. Why were they going to bring him in to that ball game? Kansas City Chiefs at the Raiders. Now take Xavier Worthy, McCole Hardman, Sky Moore, and Justin Watson in the receiving game. But now Juju Smith-Schuster, the latest wide receiver to go down for this Kansas City team. And Andy Reid already came out and said he's not going to play with the hamstring injury. Now it's next man up. So Xavier Worthy, he's a flex option for me this week. I know the numbers really haven't been there, and he's been a total boom or bust type of wide receiver, but something's got to give, and it's a great matchup indoors at the Vegas Raiders. So Worthy's a flex option, and McCole Hardman, he's a sit for me. I know he found the end zone last week. It was hard. It was a nice play call from this Kansas City Chief team, but these guys are speedy wide receivers. They're not really number ones, but I believe Worthy, he can find some holes in that Raiders secondary with his speed. And this week, he's a flex, and McCole Hardman, have to see more out of him. He's a sit. Jacoby Myers, he's been out the last couple weeks, but this is a very tough matchup. One of the great defenses in the league this season. So Myers, if he's back, it's going to be tough sledding with Minshew in there, quarterback, with O'Connell out 4 to 6 weeks with his injury. And Trey Tucker, we've seen some decent games out of him in the early part of the season, but the last couple weeks, pedestrian to non-existent numbers, he's a sit. Carolina Panthers at the Broncos, Deontay Johnson, it looks like Surtain's going to return in this ball game, and I believe he's going to be on Johnson a majority of this game. And Johnson, it's been one good week, one bad week strategy. And pretty much with this Panther team as a whole, it's been like that. So he's a flex. Xavier Legette, seen some flashes, no doubt about it, from the first-round rookie this season in the NFL draft. But consistency hasn't been there. And he's just more of a guy in dynasty and keeper leagues. I would have on my roster in 12-team leagues or deeper. Caesar Sid, Cortland Sutton, Troy Franklin, Devon Valet, all sits. I think the Broncos in this one, it's going to be about their defense and the running game to get off to an early start, where once again we won't see the wide receivers really doing much. Like last week, Cortland Sutton had the goose egg. I know this week a great matchup it is, but I'm not trusting to put him out there in the starting lineup. Troy Franklin, decent game, 5 catches, 50 yards last week, but we have to see way more out of him. On Valet, besides 2 good games this season in week 1 and week 6, we haven't seen much out of him. He's a sit. That was Cowboys at the San Francisco 49ers. CeeDee Lamb, he's locked in as a start each and every week. The only thing with Lamb, he hasn't had that patented 35-point fantasy game. And this week, it's a tough matchup, no doubt about it, at the Niners. But I believe the Cowboys will be trailing early and often, and CeeDee Lamb will put up decent numbers. Jalen Tolbert's a sit for me in this one. I know Tolbert's definitely showed flashes. Brandon Cooks, he's still out with the knee injury. And Tolbert and Dak Prescott obviously built a rapport in training camp where CeeDee Lamb was holding out that whole camp. But still, it's tough to trust Jalen Tolbert in this situation. And I just have to see a little bit more out of him. He's definitely ownable in 12, 14-team leagues. But this week, he's a sit. Now, Ricky Pearsall, Jawan Jennings, they're going to step in as the wide receivers for the San Francisco 49er team. We know Ayuk out for the season, torn ACL. Just a horrible hit he took on that knee, and it buckled back. And now Deebo Samuel, he's all banged up with the pneumonia and water building up in the lungs, and no timetable for his return as well. So now it's down to Ricky Pearsall and Jawan Jennings, and both these guys are flex option. I know this Cowboy defense hasn't been good, especially the last 3 weeks of the season, and the Lions coming off a 47-9 victory at the Cowboys in Week 6. Pearsall, Jennings, they're going to get their looks in this ball game if Jennings comes back with the hip as well. We know Jennings in Week 3 went for 11 for 175 and 3 touchdowns. So this week, it's an interesting week after what's shaking out on Monday night and injuries coming out at the wide receiver position. So Jennings and Pearsall, as I have them as flex options, they're definitely wide receivers that should be owned in 10, 12-team leagues. In the final game of the week, Monday night, Giants at the Steelers neighbors, he's locked in as a start each and every week. I know last week it was a down game, 4 catches, 41 yards. But Daniel Jones, he had no time in the pocket. And Malik Neighbors, he's just a freak athlete and a great wideout. So he's a start this week. Wan'Dale Robinson, a flex. He fits this offense well. What Daniel Jones wants to do is Wan'Dale Robinson. But we just have to see a little bit more out of him where he's a bona fide starter each and every week. And obviously this is a tougher matchup as well. Now to the Steelers, George Pickens, a start for me in this one. Him and Russ definitely more on the same page. And I know Pickens made an acrobatic juggle grab for big yards in that ball game as well. But he went over 100 yards and found the end zone. And the Steelers destroyed the Jets 37-15. So Pickens, maybe he finally found the quarterback where he'll be more consistent. And this week versus a bad Giants secondary, he's a start this week. So that's wide receiver start sits every matchup for Week 8 of the fantasy football season.